Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This present video is the second of two in which I'm presenting an introduction to the 17th century English poet John Milton, in advance of my series on his epic poem, Paradise Lost. In the earlier video, I discussed the turbulent political and religious climate in England in the years before Milton was born and during his lifetime, including Milton's father being disinherited by his father because he converted from Catholicism to Protestantism. I mentioned this rift in Milton's own family to indicate how serious such matters were in the 16th and 17th centuries. These political and religious tensions would converge and come to a crisis point in the English Civil War of the 1640s. So Milton is living during that historical period, a very important historical period, and he played a very active role in the English Revolution. And his Protestantism came by him naturally. His alignment with revolutionary and progressive politics signaled early on. Even in college, he attended Cambridge University, and of the two traditional universities in England, Cambridge and Oxford, Oxford was then and still is associated more with conservative politics, and Cambridge was then and still is associated more with liberal politics or progressive politics. Milton did his bachelor's degree at Cambridge. He continued there and got a master's degree, graduating in 1632. And after leaving Cambridge, he had a very indulgent father, and he still wanted to study. So he spent 6 more years studying independently, reading the classics, reading Latin and Greek and Hebrew at his father's country house in the village of Hammersmith, which was then in the country, but now it's a kind of part of London. And in May of 1638, he embarked on what has been called the Grand Tour of Europe, traveling around in Italy and France, and looking at old churches and famous paintings and meeting people and visiting universities. He met Galileo, but in 1639, he returned home. He cut short his travels. Milton already and always had been writing about and been boldly saying that he imagined that he was going to be the great epic poet of England. And he imagined that he might write an epic about King Arthur or some national heroic epic. But he put that aside when he got back, and he began to write political pamphlets. Some of them were quite radical and quite controversial. In Of Reformation and on the Reason of Church Government, Milton argues that the believer's understanding of God should be direct and unmediated by formal aspects of religion, including, of course, the interpretations of a priest, the church hierarchy, the liturgy of the church, even the High Anglican Church. These human-invented structures, he said, unjustifiably obstruct and corrupt the believer's understanding of God. The relationship between the human and the divine should be a direct spiritual communion, according to this argument. The biblical text, Scripture, is the best medium for access to God rather than the extrinsic trappings of the Christian tradition that have been added by the formal church. Then, Milton published the divorce pamphlets, in which he argued essentially for divorce on demand. And this was really radical. Now, it's not quite as radical as it sounds, because his argument was for divorce on demand for the husband and not for the wife. But the argument can be extended, and it was really threatening to conservatives in the church, and he argued for it, maybe partly because he wasn't getting along very well with his first wife. In Of Education, Milton argues that education should not be strictly focused on vocational skills, but should also include study of languages, rhetoric, poetry, philosophy. And in Areopagitica, his pamphlet on censorship, and this, Milton argues against censorship prior to publication. Then, maybe for the time at least, his most shocking and controversial pamphlets, arguing that it was legitimate for a people to overthrow a tyrant, to overthrow their own king. Milton is a justification of Oliver Cromwell's action in arresting and executing King Charles I, Milton defends the action against the royalist argument that the monarch rules as God's appointed minister, and to overthrow the monarch would be to reject God. Well, after Charles I's death, then there was what is called the interregnum, the period between two kings, when England was ruled by the protectorate rather than a kingdom. And as I said, in 1558, Cromwell died. His son Richard Cromwell became Lord Protector, but he couldn't hold it together and sustain control of the government. 1660, the Parliament invites Charles's son, now Charles II, to come back and assume the throne. But even in 1660, Milton is still writing controversial tracts. He wrote De Doctrina Christiana, written sometime between 1655 and 1660. And in that text, Milton argued that no person should be required to attend church, and every person should interpret the Bible for himself or herself. What's the problem with requiring that people go to church? What's the theological problem for Milton? Imagine. Just because you make someone go to church doesn't make them religious, and in fact, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of worship. It's not really worship. Then the believer is simply a puppet of God. And what's the whole point of human life? So Milton made that argument. Then in the ready and easy way to establish a free commonwealth, he argued against the restoration of the monarchy. It was an argument that was not going his way. It was a very dangerous thing to write, and in fact, it put his life in danger. Now, he's already blind at this time. He's not really very dangerous, but he was arrested, and his friend and fellow poet Andrew Marvell, who had been a member of the Parliament as well, argued on his behalf and convinced the authorities that he wouldn't cause any trouble. He turned himself then back to his task that he had envisioned from an early age of writing the great epic poem of England. So in the 1660s, Milton will write the three long poems for which he is most remembered today: Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. In other webcasts, I'll have some things to say about Paradise Lost, but for now, I'll conclude this episode. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.